The grand cathedral bells of Newport rang out across the Atlantic breeze as society's elite gathered for what promised to be the wedding of the century. Miss Evangeline Ashworth, daughter of railroad magnate Theodore Ashworth, stood radiant in ivory silk and ancestral pearls, her heart racing with anticipation. But as Duke Harrison Blackwood turned to face the congregation instead of his bride, his words would shatter more than just one woman's dreams. "I cannot marry a woman whose family's new money could never wash away the stench of common trade," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the stunned assembly. Yet as gasps echoed through the cathedral, Evangeline did something no one expected. She smiled, her emerald eyes gleaming with a dangerous light that would haunt the Duke forever. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the Ashworth mansion's breakfast room, casting rainbow patterns across the mahogany table where Evangeline sat reviewing her wedding preparations. Newport's most prestigious families had built their summer cottages along Bellevue Avenue, but none rivaled the grandeur of Ashworth Hall, with its 70 rooms and commanding view of the Atlantic Ocean. "The florist confirms white roses and baby's breath for the cathedral arrangements," announced Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, Evangeline's mother, her voice carrying the practiced refinement of a woman who had spent 15 years transforming herself from a shopkeeper's daughter into Newport society's most formidable hostess. "And the Duke's mother has approved the menu for the wedding breakfast." Evangeline nodded absently, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words: auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, intelligent green eyes, and a graceful bearing that spoke of careful cultivation. Yet beneath her composed exterior, a restless spirit yearned for something beyond the gilded cage of her predetermined future. "The Duke arrives this afternoon for the final fitting," her mother continued, consulting her leather-bound notebook with military precision. "His valet has confirmed that the Blackwood family jewels will be presented tomorrow morning, including the famous sapphire tiara worn by every Duchess of Blackwood for 3 centuries, the weight of tradition pressed down upon Evangeline like a physical force. Duke Harrison Blackwood represented everything her parents had worked to achieve: old money, established bloodlines, and a title that would elevate the Ashworth name from nouveau riche to aristocratic permanence. Their engagement had been arranged when she was barely 18, a business transaction disguised as romance. "Mother," Evangeline began carefully, "have you ever wondered if the Duke truly wishes to marry me or merely the Ashworth fortune?" Mrs. Ashworth's cup clinked sharply against its saucer. Evangeline Rose Ashworth, such thoughts are beneath you. The Duke is a gentleman of impeccable breeding. Your father's investments have secured your future, and tomorrow you will become a duchess. What more could any woman desire? Through the window, Evangeline watched the gardeners tending to the elaborate topiary maze her father had commissioned to rival those of European estates. Everything in their world was carefully constructed, meticulously planned, designed to project an image of belonging among families whose wealth stretched back generations. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was merely another acquisition in her father's vast collection of symbols. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced an arrival. Evangeline's heart quickened as she recognized the Blackwood coat of arms emblazoned on the approaching vehicle. Duke Harrison Blackwood emerged with characteristic precision, tall, impeccably dressed, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his aristocratic features arranged in an expression of polite indifference that never seemed to waver. "Your Grace, Mrs. Ashworth curtsied as he entered the breakfast room, her deference absolute despite her husband's wealth dwarfing the Duke's inherited holdings. "Mrs. Ashworth, Miss Ashworth." His bow was perfectly calculated, neither too deep nor too shallow. When his pale blue eyes met Evangeline's, she searched for warmth, affection, even simple human interest. Instead, she found the same cool assessment he might give a thoroughbred horse at auction. "I trust the preparations meet with your approval, Your Grace," Evangeline asked, rising gracefully. "Naturally. The Blackwood name has never been associated with anything less than perfection." His smile was practiced, charming in its way, yet it never reached his eyes. "I have come to discuss the final arrangements with your father. There are certain expectations regarding your conduct as my Duchess that require clarification." The casual dismissal in his tone made Evangeline's cheeks burn, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Your Grace. I am eager to learn how I might best serve the Blackwood legacy." "Excellent. Your willingness to be guided speaks well of your upbringing, despite its unconventional nature." The slight emphasis on unconventional carried the weight of centuries of aristocratic disdain for those who had earned rather than inherited their position, as her mother led the Duke toward her father's study. Evangeline remained by the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Tomorrow she would walk down the aisle of Trinity Church, Newport's most fashionable cathedral, wearing a gown that cost more than most families earned in a year. The guest list read like a directory of American aristocracy: Astors, Vanderbilts, Whitneys, all gathered to witness her transformation from railroad heiress to duchess. Yet as she watched the Duke's rigid posture disappear into the mansion's depths, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the October breeze. In his eyes, she had seen something that terrified her more than any open cruelty: complete indifference to her as a person. To him, she was not Evangeline. With her secret love of poetry and her dreams of traveling beyond the narrow confines of society's expectations, she was simply Miss Ashworth, a means to an end, a solution to his family's financial difficulties. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Persian rugs as voices drifted from her father's study. She caught fragments of conversation: dowry amounts, property transfers, the careful negotiation of a merger disguised as a marriage. Her future was being decided in terms of stocks and bonds, real estate holdings, and social positioning. But what disturbed her most was not the Duke's coldness, but her own growing certainty that tomorrow's ceremony would seal her fate in ways she was only beginning to understand. As the first stars appeared over Newport Harbor, Evangeline wondered if she was walking toward her destiny or her doom. The morning of October 15, 1895, dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the Gothic windows of Trinity Church. Newport's social elite had gathered in their finest attire, the women resplendent in silk and jewels, the men distinguished in morning coats and top hats. The cathedral's interior blazed with thousands of white roses, their fragrance mingling with the scent of expensive perfumes and the weight of collective anticipation. Evangeline stood in the church's bridal chamber, her reflection multiplied in the ornate mirrors that surrounded her. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of French craftsmanship of aureus silk adorned with seed pearls and delicate lace that had taken a dozen seamstresses 6 months to complete. The Ashworth family diamonds sparkled at her throat, while her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the light with each nervous breath. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," whispered Aunt Cordelia, adjusting the cathedral-length veil that had been worn by 3 generations of Blackwood brides. "The Duke is a fortunate man indeed." Through the chamber's window, Evangeline could see the carriages still arriving, disgorging passengers whose names graced the social registers of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Mrs. Caroline Astor herself had made the journey from Manhattan, her presence lending the ultimate seal of approval to the union. The wedding breakfast afterward would host 400 guests in the Ashworth Mansion's ballroom, with champagne flowing and an orchestra imported from Vienna. Miss Evangeline, her lady's maid Sarah, approached with trembling hands. "Your father requests your presence." "It's time." The processional music began as Evangeline took her father's arm. Theodore Ashworth, resplendent in his morning coat, squeezed her hand gently. "You've made me proud, daughter. Today you take your rightful place among America's finest families." The cathedral doors opened, and Evangeline began her walk down the aisle lined with Newport's most influential citizens. She could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, hear the whispered admiration for her beauty, her gown, the sheer magnificence of the spectacle. At the altar, Duke Harrison Blackwood waited in his formal attire, his expression unreadable as she approached. But as Evangeline drew closer, she noticed something that made her heart skip. The Duke's attention was not on her, but on someone in the front pew. Following his gaze, she saw Miss Charlotte Pemberton, her own cousin and former closest friend, dressed in a stunning emerald gown that perfectly complemented her golden hair. Charlotte's smile was radiant, her eyes locked with the Duke's in a moment of intimate understanding that excluded everyone else in the cathedral. The realization hit Evangeline like a physical blow, but she continued her measured pace, her training and deportment carrying her forward even as her world began to crumble. When she reached the altar, the Duke finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw not love or even affection, but something far worse, pity mixed with contempt. "Dearly beloved," began Bishop Morrison, his voice echoing through the cathedral, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Harrison Charles Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood, and Miss Evangeline Rose Ashworth in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over the congregation, but Evangeline felt as though she were watching the scene from a great distance. The Duke's responses were correct but mechanical, delivered with the same enthusiasm one might show when reciting a grocery list. When the bishop asked if anyone present knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage, the silence stretched longer than tradition demanded. Then, in a moment that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for decades to come, Duke Harrison Blackwood did the unthinkable. Instead of taking Evangeline's hand for the exchange of vows, he turned to face the congregation, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the cathedral. "I find I cannot proceed with this ceremony," he announced, his aristocratic accent cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "While Miss Ashworth is undoubtedly a woman of many fine qualities, I have come to realize that a union based solely on financial convenience would be a disservice to us both." Gasps echoed through the cathedral as society's most powerful figures struggled to process what they were witnessing. Astor's fans snapped shut with an audible crack while whispers began to ripple through the pews like wildfire. But the Duke was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing stronger, I cannot marry a woman whose family's new money could never wash away the stench of common trade. The Blackwood name has been associated with nobility for 8 centuries. I will not be the Duke who dilutes that legacy by allying with merchants and railroad speculators, regardless of their current wealth. The words hit Evangeline like physical blows, each syllable designed to wound and humiliate. She felt the blood drain from her face as 400 pairs of eyes turned to witness her destruction. Her father's face had gone purple with rage, while her mother appeared on the verge of fainting. In that moment of absolute devastation, something extraordinary happened. Instead of collapsing in tears or fleeing in shame, Evangeline felt a strange calm descend upon her. The Duke's cruelty had been so complete, so publicly devastating, that it had somehow freed her from the prison of caring what these people thought. She looked directly at Duke Harrison Blackwood, her green eyes blazing with an inner fire that made him take an involuntary step backward. Then, to the amazement of everyone present, she smiled, not the practiced, demure smile of a society belle, but something far more dangerous. Your Grace, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics, you have indeed made a choice today, but I believe you will discover that you have made the biggest mistake of your life. The Duke's confident expression faltered, slightly at the certainty in her voice, but he recovered quickly. I think not, Miss Ashworth. I am quite confident in my decision. Time will tell, Evangeline replied, her smile never wavering. But I suspect that years from now, when you are struggling to maintain your crumbling estates, and your title means nothing more than an entry in a dusty genealogy book, you will remember this moment and realize exactly what you threw away. With that, she turned and walked back down the aisle with her head held high, her father and mother hurrying to catch up. Behind her, the cathedral erupted in chaos, as 400 guests tried to process the most scandalous scene in Newport's social history. But as Evangeline emerged into the bright October sunlight, she felt something she had never experienced before, the intoxicating rush of absolute freedom. The Duke had destroyed her carefully planned future, but in doing so, he had also destroyed the golden cage that had confined her dreams. What would she do with this unexpected liberation? 3 weeks after the catastrophe at Trinity Church, Evangeline found herself standing on the platform of Grand Central Terminal in New York City, her traveling trunk beside her and a single carpet bag in her gloved hand. The bustling crowds, the steam from arriving locomotives, and the cacophony of urban life felt like a symphony of possibility after the suffocating silence that had descended upon Newport society. Her destination was the brownstone residence of her father's sister, Miss Agatha Ashworth, on East 73rd Street. Aunt Agatha had never married, a choice that had scandalized the family 20 years earlier but now seemed remarkably prescient. She had used her inheritance to establish herself as one of New York's most respected philanthropists and had written to Evangeline immediately after news of the wedding debacle reached Manhattan. My dear niece, the letter had read, if you wish to discover who you truly are beyond the expectations of others, my door is always open. New York has a way of revealing one's authentic self, if one has the courage to look. The Ashworth brownstone stood in elegant contrast to the ostentatious mansions of Fifth Avenue. Its understated facade spoke of confidence rather than display, substance over spectacle. When Evangeline rang the bell, the door was opened not by a formal butler, but by Aunt Agatha herself, a woman of 55 with silver-streaked auburn hair, intelligent gray eyes, and a bearing that suggested she had never apologized for taking up space in the world. Evangeline, my dear child, Agatha embraced her warmly. You look positively luminous. Scandal, it seems, agrees with you far better than propriety ever did. The brownstone's interior reflected its owner's character, comfortable rather than grand, filled with books, artwork, and the accumulated treasures of a life lived on one's own terms. The drawing room overlooked a small garden where autumn roses still bloomed, despite the October chill. I've taken the liberty of canceling all social obligations for the next month, Agatha announced as they settled with tea. You need time to breathe, to think, to discover what Evangeline Ashworth wants from life when she's not performing for an audience. I'm not certain. I know how to be anything other than what I was trained to be, Evangeline admitted, her composure finally cracking. Everything I was taught, everything I believed about my future was destroyed in a single moment. Good, Agatha said briskly. Destruction often precedes creation. The Duke did you an enormous favor, though I suspect he's too much of a fool to realize it. Over the following days, Evangeline began to experience a life she had never imagined possible. Aunt Agatha's circle included writers, artists, physicians, and reformers, people who valued ideas over inheritance, accomplishment over ancestry. The conversations at Agatha's dinner table ranged from women's suffrage to urban poverty, from scientific discoveries to literary criticism. "Miss Ashworth," said Dr. Margaret Whitman, one of the first women to graduate from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, "your aunt tells me you have a keen interest in social reform. Have you considered that your experience might give you unique insight into the constraints placed upon women of your class?" The suggestion was revolutionary. Evangeline had been raised to be ornamental, to grace drawing rooms and produce heirs. The idea that her thoughts and opinions might have value beyond their ability to charm potential suitors was intoxicating. It was at one of Agatha's literary salons that Evangeline first encountered Dr. Elias Reed. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that Newport society valued. His features were too strong, his manner too direct, his hands bearing the calluses of someone who worked for a living. But when he spoke about his medical practice in the Lower East Side, treating immigrants and the working poor, his passion illuminated his entire being. The conditions these families endure would shock most of polite society, he was saying to the assembled group. Children working in factories instead of attending school, families of 8 crowded into single rooms, diseases that could be prevented with basic sanitation and nutrition. "Surely the city government has programs to address these issues?" asked Mrs. Helena Morrison, a society matron who attended Agatha's salons to feel progressive without actually challenging her comfortable assumptions. Dr. Reed's laugh was bitter. "The city government is more concerned with the comfort of those who can afford to contribute to political campaigns. The poor have no voice, no representation, no advocate except for a few dedicated souls who work without recognition or reward." Evangeline found herself leaning forward, captivated not just by his words but by the conviction behind them. "Dr. Reed, what would it take to make a meaningful difference? If someone had resources but lacked experience, how might they contribute?" He turned to look at her directly, and she felt the full force of his attention like a physical sensation. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and held an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Miss Ashworth, meaningful change requires more than charitable donations, though those are certainly needed. It requires understanding, commitment, and a willingness to challenge the very systems that create and maintain inequality. It means getting one's hands dirty, literally and figuratively. I believe I'm ready to get my hands dirty. Dr. Reed." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but she realized they were absolutely true. For the first time in her life, she felt the stirring of genuine purpose, something beyond the narrow confines of social expectations. Over the following weeks, Evangeline began accompanying Dr. Reed on his rounds through the tenements of the Lower East Side. The poverty she witnessed was shocking. Families living in conditions that would be considered inhumane for animals, children with hollow eyes and empty bellies, mothers aged beyond their years by hardship and despair. But she also discovered something unexpected: her own capacity for useful work. Her education, dismissed by the Duke as merely ornamental, proved invaluable in organizing medical records, corresponding with suppliers, and managing the complex logistics of Dr. Reed's expanding practice. "You have a remarkable mind for organization," he told her one evening as they reviewed the day's patient files in his modest office. "And more importantly, you have the rare ability to see people as individuals rather than statistics." The compliment warmed her more than any flattery about her beauty ever had. For the first time, someone valued her intelligence, her capabilities, her potential to make a meaningful contribution to the world. "Dr. Reed," she said carefully, "I find myself wondering what my life might have been like if I had been encouraged to develop these abilities from the beginning, rather than simply preparing to be someone's decorative wife." He looked up from his papers, his expression serious. "Miss Ashworth, it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The question is, what do you want your life to stand for?" As autumn deepened into winter, Evangeline felt herself changing in ways that went far beyond her circumstances. The woman who had stood at that altar in Newport seemed like a stranger, passive, decorative, defined entirely by others' expectations. In her place was emerging someone she was only beginning to recognize, a woman with opinions, ambitions, and the courage to pursue them. But late at night, as she sat in her room overlooking Aunt Agatha's garden, she sometimes wondered about the Duke. Had he married Charlotte as everyone expected? Was he satisfied with his choice? And more troubling still, why did she find herself hoping that he was beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake? What would happen when their paths inevitably crossed again? The invitation arrived on a crisp February morning, delivered by a liveried messenger to Aunt Agatha's brownstone. Mrs. S. Caroline Astor herself was hosting the annual winter charity gala at her Fifth Avenue mansion, and Miss Evangeline Ashworth's presence was specifically requested. The event would raise funds for the Children's Aid Society. a cause that had become dear to Evangeline's heart through her work with Dr. Reed. "You must attend," Agatha declared, examining the elegant invitation with its gold embossing. "It's time for New York society to see what you've become, rather than what you were expected to be." Evangeline had changed dramatically during her months in the city. Her work in the tenements had given her a confidence that no amount of deportment lessons could have instilled. She moved with purpose now, spoke with authority on subjects that mattered, and carried herself with the bearing of a woman who knew her own worth. "I confess I'm curious to see how they'll receive me," Evangeline admitted. "The last time I appeared at a major social function, I was publicly humiliated and left at the altar." "Precisely why you must go," Agatha smiled. "Show them that Evangeline Ashworth cannot be broken by one man's cruelty, no matter how public the spectacle." The gown Evangeline chose for the occasion was a masterpiece of understated elegance, deep sapphire silk that brought out the green in her eyes with a design that spoke of sophistication rather than ostentation. Her jewelry was simple but exquisite, her grandmother's pearl necklace and matching earrings. She looked every inch the lady she had been raised to be, but with something new, an inner radiance that came from knowing she was more than just a beautiful ornament. Dr. Reed had offered to escort her, a gesture that had surprised and pleased her more than she cared to admit. Over the months of working together, their professional relationship had deepened into something more complex. He treated her as an intellectual equal, valued her contributions, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. More importantly, he saw her as Evangeline, not as Miss Ashworth of the railroad fortune. "You look magnificent," he said as he helped her into the carriage. "But more than that, you look like yourself, the woman you were always meant to be." The Astor Mansion blazed with light as their carriage joined the procession of vehicles depositing New York's elite at the grand entrance. The ballroom was a vision of winter splendor, decorated with white roses and silver accents that caught the light from massive crystal chandeliers. The city's most influential families were in attendance, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum that spoke of power, wealth, and carefully maintained social hierarchies. Evangeline's entrance caused a noticeable stir. Conversations paused as heads turned to observe the woman who had been so spectacularly rejected at the altar just 4 months earlier. But instead of the broken, humiliated creature they expected to see, they found someone transformed, poised, radiant, and accompanied by a distinguished gentleman whose reputation as a humanitarian was well known in progressive circles. Miss Ashworth, Mrs. Astor herself approached, her expression carefully neutral. "How delightful to see you in the city. I trust you are finding New York to your liking?" "Indeed, Mrs. Astor. I've discovered that the city offers opportunities for meaningful work that I'd never imagined possible. Dr. Reed and I have been collaborating on several initiatives to improve medical care for the city's most vulnerable residents." The mention of actual work, paid or otherwise, among the leisure class was mildly scandalous. But Evangeline's confident delivery and Dr. Reed's respected presence lent it an air of noble purpose rather than desperate necessity. As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself at the center of animated conversations about social reform, women's education, and urban poverty. Her months of practical experience gave weight to her words, and her natural intelligence, finally given proper outlet, shone brilliantly. It was during the dinner service that she first spotted familiar faces from Newport. Charlotte Pemberton, now Charlotte Blackwood. Duchess of Blackwood stood near the orchestra in a gown of cloth of gold that probably cost more than Dr. Reed's annual salary. She was as beautiful as ever, but there was something brittle about her smile, something forced about her laughter. Beside her stood Duke Harrison Blackwood himself, resplendent in white tie and tails, his aristocratic features arranged in their customary expression of polite boredom. But when his eyes met Evangeline's across the crowded ballroom, she saw something flicker there, surprise, perhaps even regret. "Evangeline, darling?" Charlotte's voice carried across the room as she approached, her smile bright and sharp as a blade. "How wonderful to see you." He looked at that, well, considering everything. The calculated cruelty of the comment was vintage Charlotte, but Evangeline found it rolled off her like water. "Charlotte, congratulations on your marriage. I hope you're finding married life everything you hoped it would be." "Oh, it's absolutely divine," Charlotte gushed, but her eyes were cold. "Harrison is such a devoted husband. We've been traveling extensively, Paris, Rome, Vienna. The Duke has such exquisite taste in everything." Dr. Reed appeared at Evangeline's elbow, his presence both protective and supportive. "Your Grace," he nodded politely to Charlotte, then turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, I don't believe we've been introduced. Dr. Elias Reed." The Duke's handshake was perfunctory, his assessment of Dr. Reed swift and dismissive. "Doctor, I trust you're not one of those radical physicians who believes in treating the unwashed masses?" "On the contrary, Your Grace. I believe that healing is a calling that transcends social boundaries." Some of my most rewarding work has been with families who possess nothing but their dignity and their determination to survive." The subtle rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that even the Duke seemed momentarily taken aback. Evangeline felt a surge of pride in her companion's integrity and courage. "How charitable of you," the Duke replied, his tone suggesting he found such sentiments quaint but misguided. "Miss Ashworth, I trust you're finding suitable occupation in the city?" The question was designed to wound, implying that her current circumstances were a step down from the life he had offered her. But Evangeline's response surprised everyone, including herself. "Indeed, Your Grace. I've discovered that there's immense satisfaction in work that actually matters, in using one's abilities to make a tangible difference in people's lives. I find I have little patience anymore for purely ornamental pursuits." The Duke's face darkened at the implied criticism of his own lifestyle, while Charlotte's smile became even more strained. Noble of you, Evangeline. Though I confess I can't imagine giving up the pleasures of proper society for such gritty endeavors. Perhaps that's the difference between us, Charlotte. I've learned that true pleasure comes from purpose, not from position." Dr. Reed stepped forward slightly, his voice warm with admiration. "Miss Ashworth has been instrumental in establishing our new clinic in the Lower East Side. Her organizational skills and genuine compassion have made it possible for us to treat twice as many patients as we could before." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Evangeline felt her heart skip at the warmth in his eyes. Here was a man who valued her for her mind, her character, her contributions to the world, not for her father's fortune, or her potential to enhance his social standing. "How fascinating," the Duke said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. "And tell me, Miss Ashworth, do you find this work provides adequate compensation for your efforts?" The question was deliberately insulting, implying that she had been reduced to working for wages like a common employee. But before Evangeline could respond, Dr. Reed's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Your Grace, I believe you misunderstand the nature of Miss Ashworth's involvement. She has chosen to dedicate her considerable talents and resources to improving the lives of others. It's the kind of noble calling that requires both privilege and character, a combination that is, sadly, quite rare in our society." The rebuke was delivered so smoothly that it took the Duke a moment to realize he had been thoroughly put in his place. When he did, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I see," he said stiffly. "Well, I'm sure you'll find such pursuits adequately fulfilling." As the Duke and Charlotte moved away, Evangeline felt a profound sense of liberation. The man who had once held the power to destroy her happiness now seemed small, petty, and utterly irrelevant to her future. "Shall we take some air?" Dr. Reed suggested, offering his arm. "I believe the terrace overlooks Mrs. Astor's famous garden." As they stepped onto the moonlit terrace away from the glittering crowd, Evangeline felt the weight of the evening's triumph settling around her like a warm cloak. She had faced her past and emerged victorious, not through revenge or spite, but through the simple act of becoming herself. "Evangeline," Dr. Reed said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." The serious tone in his voice made her turn to face him fully, her heart beginning to race with anticipation. In the moonlight, his strong features were softened, and she could see something in his eyes that made her breath catch. What question could be so important that it required the privacy of this moment, away from the watching eyes of society? The moonlight cast silver patterns across the terrace as Dr. Reed took Evangeline's hands in his touch warm and steady despite the February chill. The sounds of the gala drifted through the French doors behind them, laughter, music, the clink of champagne glasses, but they seemed to belong to another world entirely. "Evangeline," he began, his voice low and earnest, "these past months working beside you have been the most meaningful of my life. You've brought not just your intelligence and resources to our work, but something far more precious, your genuine compassion for those society has forgotten." Her pulse quickened as she saw the depth of emotion in his dark eyes. This was not the calculated proposal she had expected from the Duke, based on social advantage and financial gain. This was something entirely different, a recognition of who she truly was, not what she represented. "When I first met you at your aunt's salon," he continued, "I saw a woman trapped in circumstances not of her choosing, but over these months I've watched you emerge like a butterfly from a chrysalis, becoming someone extraordinary, someone who chooses to use her privileges to lift others rather than simply to elevate herself." The contrast with her previous engagement could not have been starker. The Duke had seen her as an acquisition, a means to solve his financial problems while maintaining his social position. Dr. Reed saw her as a partner, an equal, someone whose contributions mattered beyond her father's bank account. "Elias," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "What are you asking me?" I'm asking if you would consider sharing not just our work but our lives. I know I cannot offer you the luxury you were born to, the social position you were raised to expect. My practice serves those who can barely afford to pay, and my brownstone is modest compared to the mansions you've known. But I can offer you something I believe you value more, a partnership of equals. A life of purpose, and a love based on who you are rather than what you possess. The proposal was everything she had never known she wanted. Here was a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable, and had helped her discover her own strength. He valued her mind, respected her opinions, and had shown her a world where her contributions mattered. Yes, she said simply, her voice clear and certain. Yes, Elias, I will marry you. His smile was radiant as he drew her closer, and when he kissed her, it was with a tenderness and passion that the Duke's perfunctory courtship had never contained. This was what love felt like, not the careful negotiation of social contracts, but the meeting of two souls who had chosen each other freely. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through both New York and Newport society. The newspapers seized upon the story with relish. Railroad heiress chooses love over title, proclaimed the New York Herald. From duchess to doctor's wife, announced the Newport Daily News with barely concealed scandal. The reaction from Evangeline's parents was swift and predictable. Theodore Ashworth arrived at Agatha's brownstone within hours of reading the announcement, his face purple with rage. "Have you lost your mind entirely?" he thundered, pacing the drawing room like a caged bear. "First you allow yourself to be humiliated by that English fool, and now you propose to throw yourself away on a common physician who treats immigrants and factory workers." "Dr. Reed is hardly common, Father," Evangeline replied calmly. "He graduated from Harvard Medical School with highest honors and has dedicated his life to serving those most in need. I consider that far more noble than inheriting a title and contributing nothing to the world." "Noble?" her father sputtered. "What's noble about poverty? What's noble about throwing away everything I've worked to build, everything I've sacrificed to give you?" Aunt Agatha, who had remained silent during the initial outburst, finally spoke. "Theodore, perhaps you should ask yourself what you truly want for your daughter, happiness and fulfillment, or simply the satisfaction of seeing your money transformed into social status." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Evangeline watched her father struggle with emotions he rarely allowed himself to examine. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly. "I wanted to give you everything I never had," he said quietly. "Security, position, respect. I wanted to ensure that no one could ever look down on you the way they looked down on me when I was building the railroad." "Father," Evangeline said gently, "you gave me something far more valuable than social position. You gave me the example of someone who built something meaningful through hard work and determination. Dr. Reed and I are simply applying those same principles to different goals. The wedding preparations were a study in contrasts to the elaborate spectacle that had been planned for her marriage to the Duke. Instead of Newport's Trinity Church, quote, they would marry in the simple chapel of Dr. Reed's medical college. Instead of 400 guests, they invited only family and close friends. Instead of a reception at a grand mansion, they would celebrate in Aunt Agatha's garden. But as the April wedding date approached, Evangeline found herself more excited than she had ever been about her future. She was choosing not just a husband, but a life of purpose and meaning. The contrast became even more stark when news reached them of the Duke and Charlotte's marriage. Society gossip suggested that the union was already showing signs of strain. Charlotte's extravagant spending was reportedly causing financial difficulties, while the Duke's cold nature had apparently extended to his treatment of his new wife. "I heard from Mrs. Whitman that the Duchess has been seen at several social functions without her husband," Aunt Agatha mentioned one afternoon as they reviewed wedding plans. "Apparently he finds her conversation tedious, and her American mannerisms embarrassing." Evangeline felt a moment of pity for Charlotte, despite their complicated history. Her cousin had achieved everything she thought she wanted: a title, a grand estate, entry into the highest levels of society, only to discover that marrying for position rather than love brought its own form of imprisonment. The night before her wedding, Evangeline stood in her room at Aunt Agatha's brownstone, looking out at the garden where tomorrow she would pledge her life to a man who saw her as an equal partner. Her wedding dress hung nearby, not the elaborate confection of silk and pearls that had been created for her first wedding, but a simpler gown of ivory silk that spoke of elegance rather than ostentation. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Aunt Agatha or perhaps her mother, who had finally arrived from Newport with grudging acceptance of her daughter's choice. Instead, she was shocked to see Charlotte standing in the doorway, her traveling costume suggesting she had come directly from the train station. "Hello, Evangeline," Charlotte said quietly, her usual brittle confidence notably absent. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I needed to speak with you before tomorrow." The two women faced each other across the room, years of friendship and betrayal hanging between them like a tangible presence. "I came to apologize," Charlotte continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's for what I did, for what I helped Harrison do to you. I thought I was winning something precious, but I've learned that a prize taken through cruelty turns to ashes in your hands." Evangeline studied her cousin's face, seeing genuine remorse there for the first time. "Charlotte, what's happened?" "I married a man who sees me as nothing more than a beautiful ornament, just as he saw you. The difference is that you escaped before it was too late. I double quotes her. Voice broke slightly. "I wake up every morning in a grand estate, wearing priceless jewels, bearing a title that opens every door in society, and I feel like I'm suffocating." The admission hung between them, raw and honest in a way that Charlotte had never been before. "I watch you tomorrow marrying a man who loves you for who you are, not what you represent, and I realize that you want everything that truly matters. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I helped destroy, and I'm sorry." Evangeline felt the last of her anger toward Charlotte dissolve. "Thank you for coming, for saying that. I hope you find a way to build something meaningful from where you are now." As Charlotte left, Evangeline realized that tomorrow represented more than just her wedding day. It marked her complete transformation from the woman who had stood at that altar in Newport, defined by others' expectations, to someone who had chosen her own path. But she prepared for sleep. She couldn't help wondering, would the Duke ever realize what he had lost, or would he remain forever blind to the magnitude of his mistake? 2 years had passed since. Evangeline read she had taken her husband's name with pride, stood in Aunt Agatha's garden, and pledged her life to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. The autumn of 1897 found her in the bustling office of the Lower East Side Medical Clinic, reviewing patient files while the sounds of the city hummed through the open windows. The crisp October air carried the scent of roasting chestnuts from street vendors and the distant sound of children playing in the narrow alleys between tenement buildings. The clinic had grown beyond their wildest dreams. What had begun as Dr. Reed's modest practice now occupied an entire 4-story building on Rivington Street, its red brick facade bearing a simple brass plaque that read Lower East Side Community Medical Center. 4 physicians, 6 nurses, 2 pharmacists, and a small army of volunteers provided medical care, health education, and social services to the immigrant families who called the tenements home. The ground floor housed the main treatment rooms and pharmacy. The second floor contained specialized services for women and children. The third floor served as administrative offices and a small library, while the fourth floor had been converted into modest living quarters for the medical staff who chose to live on site. Evangeline had proven instrumental in every aspect of the clinic's expansion. Her natural organizational abilities, honed by years of managing complex social events, had translated seamlessly into coordinating medical supplies, scheduling patient care, and creating efficient systems that allowed them to treat nearly 1,000 patients each month. More importantly, her genuine compassion and her ability to speak multiple languages, a skill she had acquired during her European finishing school education, had made her beloved among the diverse immigrant communities they served. Mrs. Reed called Mary O'Sullivan one of their newest nurses, her Irish accent still thick despite 3 years in America. The delegation from the Children's Aid Society has arrived for their tour. "They're particularly interested in seeing our maternal health program." Evangeline looked up from her correspondence with the mayor's office regarding expanded funding for their tuberculosis prevention program. At 24, she had grown into her role as the clinic's chief administrator with a confidence that would have been impossible during her Newport days. Her auburn hair was now styled in a practical Gibson girl arrangement that stayed neat throughout long days of work, and her clothing, well-tailored but simple dresses in dark colors that wouldn't show the inevitable stains of medical work, reflected her transformation from ornamental society belle to working professional. Yet she possessed a radiance that made her more beautiful than she had ever been in her days of elaborate gowns and jeweled tiaras. "Excellent, Mary. Please show them to the main treatment room and offer them tea. I'll join them in just a moment. I need to finish this letter to Dr. Jacoby about our scarlet fever outbreak protocols." The tour was part of Evangeline's ongoing efforts to expand their model to other parts of the city. The success of their clinic had attracted attention from reformers, philanthropists, and medical professionals who wanted to replicate their approach in other underserved neighborhoods. As she led the delegation through the spotless facilities, her voice carried the authority of someone who knew every detail of their operation intimately. "Our maternal mortality rate has dropped by 60% since we began our prenatal education program," she explained to the group of distinguished visitors as they observed a class where immigrant women learned about nutrition, hygiene, and infant care. "We've found that education is often more powerful than medicine in preventing complications." Dr. Sarah Blackwell, one of the few women physicians in New York and a pioneer in her own right, raised her hand. Mrs. Reed, how did you manage to overcome the cultural barriers? Many of these women come from traditions where medical care is viewed with suspicion, particularly when provided by outsiders. Evangeline smiled, remembering her own early struggles to gain the trust of the community. The key was hiring staff who reflected the diversity of our patients. Our head nurse, Mrs. Rosenberg, is fluent in Yiddish and Russian. Dr. Castellano speaks Italian and Spanish. I learned enough German and Polish to communicate basic medical concepts. But most importantly, we made it clear that we were here to serve, not to judge or change their cultural practices unless those practices directly threatened health. She led them to the children's ward, where young patients recovering from various ailments were engaged in educational activities designed by Evangeline herself. We've learned that treating illness is only part of our mission. We also focus on preventing future problems through education, nutrition programs, and environmental improvements. The delegation was particularly impressed by the clinic's innovative record-keeping system, which Evangeline had developed to track not just individual patient outcomes, but community health trends. Charts and graphs lined the walls of her office, showing dramatic improvements in infant mortality, infectious disease rates, and overall life expectancy in their service area. Mrs. Reed asked Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., who was representing his father's interest in urban reform, "How did you manage to secure such consistent funding?" Most charitable endeavors struggle with financial sustainability after the initial enthusiasm wanes. The key, Evangeline explained, settling into her element as she discussed the business aspects of their operation, is demonstrating measurable results and treating donors as partners rather than simply sources of money. We provide quarterly reports showing exactly how their contributions translate into improved health outcomes. We invite them to visit to see the work firsthand, to meet the families whose lives have been changed. She pulled out a leather-bound ledger filled with meticulous financial records. We also diversify our funding sources. We receive support from wealthy individuals, yes, but also from religious organizations, women's clubs, labor unions, and even some of the more successful immigrant families who want to give back to their communities. We charge fees on a sliding scale based on ability to pay, which provides about 30% of our operating budget while ensuring that no one is turned away for lack of funds. It was a lesson she had learned from observing her father's business acumen, applied now to humanitarian rather than commercial purposes. The irony was not lost on her that the skills she had been taught to manage a grand household budgeting, staff supervision, inventory management, social networking had proven invaluable in running a medical clinic that served some of the city's most vulnerable residents. As the delegation departed with promises to recommend their model to other cities, Evangeline returned to her office to find her husband waiting with a bouquet of autumn roses from their small rooftop garden and a smile that still made her heart skip after 2 years of marriage. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure, Dr. Reed?" she asked, accepting his kiss with the easy affection of a couple who had built their relationship on genuine partnership and mutual respect. "Can't a man bring flowers to his brilliant wife without requiring a special occasion?" he replied, but his dark eyes held a particular warmth that suggested something more significant than a simple romantic gesture, "though I confess I do have news that I thought you'd want to hear immediately." Evangeline set the roses in a simple glass vase on her desk, noting how their vibrant colors brightened the modest office with its practical furniture, and walls lined with medical texts and patient charts. "Good news or concerning news? Your expression suggests it's something quite important. That depends entirely on your perspective, and your appetite for new challenges." Elias settled into the chair across from her desk, his expression mixing excitement with slight apprehension. "I received a letter today from Dr. William Osler at Johns Hopkins Medical School. He's heard about our work here and wants to invite us to Baltimore to consult on establishing a similar clinic there. But that's not all. He's also interested in having us present our methods at the upcoming National Conference on Urban Health Reform in Washington." Evangeline's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that had become characteristic of her response to professional challenges. The opportunity to influence medical care and social reform on a national scale was exactly the kind of work that energized her. "Elias, that's wonderful. When would we need to travel?" "Next month for the initial consultation, then Washington in December for the conference. But there's something else that I think will particularly interest you." His smile broadened as he pulled out the official letter. "Dr. Osler specifically mentions your contributions to our success. He's heard about your administrative innovations, your community outreach methods, and your funding strategies. He wants you to present a full paper on sustainable models for community-based medical care to an audience that will include some of the most respected physicians, social reformers, and public health officials in the country." The recognition was both thrilling and daunting. 2 years ago, She had been a woman whose greatest accomplishment was successfully managing a dinner party for 50 guests. Now she was being invited to share her expertise with some of the most respected minds in medicine and social reform, to potentially influence how medical care was delivered to underserved populations across the nation. "There's more," Elias continued, his voice taking on a note of pride that made her heart swell. "The letter mentions that several medical schools are interested in developing formal training programs based on our model. They want to teach future physicians not just how to treat disease, but how to work effectively within communities, how to address the social factors that contribute to poor health, how to build sustainable practices that serve those who need care most." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes as she contemplated the magnitude of what they had built together. What had begun as her desperate need to find purpose after her public humiliation had evolved into work that could potentially transform how medicine was practiced throughout the country. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the office door. "Come in," Evangeline called, expecting to see one of their staff members with a question about patient care or administrative matters. Instead, the door opened to reveal a figure from her past that made her breath catch: Duke Harrison Blackwood, looking considerably less polished than she remembered. His clothing, while still expensive and well-tailored, showed signs of wear that spoke of financial constraints. His once perfect posture had developed a slight stoop, and there was something haggard about his appearance that went beyond mere fatigue. The confident arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "Your Grace," Dr. Reed rose immediately, his professional courtesy masking his surprise at this unexpected visitor. It's quite unexpected. How may we assist you?" The Duke's eyes moved slowly around the office, taking in the medical texts, the patient charts, the evidence of meaningful work being accomplished. When his gaze finally settled on Evangeline, she saw something there that shocked her genuine regret mixed with what appeared to be profound sadness. "Mrs. Reed, Dr. Reed," he said formally, his voice lacking the commanding tone she remembered. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I find myself in need of medical attention, and your clinic was recommended by Dr. Margaret Whitman. She spoke very highly of your work here." Evangeline studied his face more carefully and noticed what she had initially missed: the slight tremor in his hands, the pallor beneath his aristocratic features, the way he favored his left side as though experiencing chronic pain. But more than his physical symptoms, she was struck by the change in his demeanor. The man who had once carried himself like he owned the world now seemed diminished, uncertain. "Of course, Your Grace, Doctor," Reed replied with the same professional compassion he showed all their patients. "Please have a seat. What symptoms have you been experiencing?" As her husband began his examination, asking gentle but thorough questions about the Duke's health, Evangeline found herself observing this man who had once held such power over her future. The Duke who had publicly humiliated her, who had dismissed her family's wealth as new money tainted by common trade, now sat in their modest clinic seeking help from the very people he had once considered beneath his notice. "Dr. Reed," the Duke said quietly during the examination, his voice barely above a whisper, "I should mention that my financial circumstances have changed considerably since we last met. The estate has been struggling, and I'm not certain I can afford your usual fees." The admission clearly cost him dearly. Evangeline saw her husband's expression soften with the compassion that had first drawn her to him, the same gentle understanding he showed to every patient regardless of their circumstances. "Your Grace, our clinic operates on a sliding scale based on ability to pay. We've treated everyone from successful merchants to families who can barely afford food. No one is turned away for lack of funds. That's one of our founding principles." After a thorough examination that revealed symptoms consistent with chronic stress, poor nutrition, and what appeared to be the early stages of an ulcer, Dr. Reed prescribed medication and dietary changes. But the Duke lingered in the office as though reluctant to leave, his eyes continuing to take in the evidence of their successful partnership. "Mrs. Reed," he said finally, his voice heavy with an emotion she had never heard from him before, "I owe you an apology that is long overdue. My behavior at at the wedding was inexcusable, cruel, and quotes." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come as helly to a man accustomed to believing himself always in the right. "Profoundly stupid." Evangeline exchanged a glance with her husband, who nodded slightly, understanding that this was a conversation she needed to have without his protective presence. Elias quietly excused himself to check on patients, leaving them alone with the weight of their shared history. "Your Grace, what's done is done," Evangeline said carefully. "I hope you've found happiness in your marriage to Charlotte." His laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "Mrs. Reed, I married a woman as shallow and grasping as I was, and we've spent 2 years making each other thoroughly miserable. while our debts mounted and our estates crumbled around us. Charlotte left last month for Paris with a French count who promised her the excitement and luxury I apparently failed to provide. The revelation was shocking, though not entirely surprising given what Evangeline had observed of their relationship during their brief encounter at Mrs. Astor's gala. She remembered Charlotte's brittle smile, the forced quality of her laughter, the way she had clung to her new title as though it were a life preserver. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it. Despite everything that had happened between them, she felt genuine sympathy for the pain in his voice. Divorce is never easy, regardless of the circumstances. "There will be no divorce," the Duke replied wearily, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his situation was physically crushing him. "Charlotte refuses to give up the tithe. It's the only thing of value she gained from our marriage, and I cannot afford the scandal. My creditors are already circling like vultures. A divorce would destroy what little remains of my reputation and make it impossible to secure the loans I need to keep the estate from complete ruin." He looked around the clinic's modest but purposeful office again, his gaze lingering on the photographs of families they had helped, the certificates of appreciation from community organizations, the evidence of lives genuinely improved through their work. "I've been reading about your clinic in the newspapers," he continued, his voice taking on a note of wonder. "The Herald ran a series of articles about the lives you've saved, the families you've helped, the measurable changes you've made in this community. They called you the angel of the Lower East Side and described Dr. Reed as a physician who embodies the highest ideals of medical practice." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "I realize now that when I rejected you at that altar, I wasn't just losing a wife, I was losing the chance to be part of something that actually mattered. I was so focused on maintaining my position, on preserving what I thought was important, that I threw away the opportunity to build something meaningful." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of choices that could never be undone. Evangeline found herself studying this broken man and trying to reconcile him with the arrogant Duke who had destroyed her carefully planned future with such casual cruelty. "Your Grace," she said gently, "it's never too late to find purpose. Your title, your connections, your knowledge of how society operates, they could all be used to make a difference if you chose to do so. There are countless ways to contribute to meaningful work." "Perhaps," he said, though his tone suggested he doubted his own capacity for such transformation. "But I fear I've spent so many years believing that my worth came from what I inherited rather than what I accomplished, that I wouldn't know where to begin." Evangeline felt a surge of the same compassion that drove her work with the clinic's patients. "Your Grace, every person who walks through our doors is struggling with something: illness, poverty, fear, despair. But we've learned that healing isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about helping people discover their own strength, their own capacity to change their circumstances." She gestured toward the window that overlooked the bustling street below, where children played despite the poverty that surrounded them, where families worked together to build better lives despite overwhelming obstacles. "The people in this neighborhood have taught me that resilience isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up, about finding ways to contribute even when your circumstances seem impossible. You have resources, education, connections that most people can only dream of. The question is whether you're willing to use them for something beyond your own comfort." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the scene outside the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defeated. "You know, Mrs. Reed, there was a time when I would have dismissed such sentiment as naive idealism. But sitting here, seeing what you and Dr. Reed have built, understanding the impact you've had on real people's lives, I find myself wondering what my life might have been like if I had learned to measure success differently." "It's not too late to learn," Evangeline said firmly. "The work we do here isn't glamorous or prestigious in the way that society traditionally values. But it's real, and it matters. And it provides a satisfaction that no amount of inherited wealth or social position could ever match." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the street below, followed by the voice of Mrs. Rosenberg calling out in Yiddish to remind them to come inside before dark. These were the sounds of a community that was thriving despite its challenges, a community that had been strengthened by the work of the clinic. "I should go," the Duke said finally, rising from his chair with obvious reluctance. "Thank you for your kindness, both of you. It's more than I deserved, certainly more than I showed you when our positions were reversed, Your Grace," Evangeline said as he reached the door. "If you're serious about finding a different path, Dr. Reed and I would be happy to discuss ways you might contribute to meaningful work. There are many organizations in the city that could benefit from someone with your background and connections." He turned back to look at her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man he might have been under different circumstances, someone capable of growth, of change, of genuine contribution to the world. I would like that very much, Mrs. Reed. Perhaps we could arrange a time to discuss such possibilities." After he left, Evangeline and her husband sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, the weight of the encounter settling around them like a heavy blanket. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked finally, his voice gentle but serious. "The path not taken? The life you might have had as a duchess?" Evangeline looked at her husband, this good, dedicated man who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, who had supported her growth into someone she could respect and admire. She thought about their work together, the lives they had touched, the partnership they had built based on mutual respect and shared values. "Never," she said firmly, reaching across the desk to take his hand. "That man destroyed my carefully planned future, but in doing so, he gave me the chance to build something infinitely better. I wouldn't trade our life, our work, our partnership for all the titles and estates in England." She gestured around their modest office, with its practical furniture and walls covered with evidence of their meaningful work. "Look at what we've accomplished together, Elias. We've built something that matters, something that will outlast us and continue to help people long after we're gone." What duchess could say the same about her life? As the sun set over the Lower East Side, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any sunset she had ever seen from the windows of grand mansions, Evangeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had stood humiliated at that altar in Newport had been someone else entirely, someone defined by others' expectations, trapped in a golden cage of privilege and propriety, valued only for her beauty and her father's wealth. The woman she had become was someone she could respect and admire, a partner in a meaningful marriage built on equality and mutual support, a contributor to important work that made a tangible difference in people's lives, a person who had chosen her own path and found it led to places more beautiful and fulfilling than any she could have imagined in her sheltered youth. The Duke had been right about one thing: he had made the biggest mistake of his life when he rejected her so cruelly and publicly. But his loss had been her liberation, his cruelty the catalyst for her transformation into someone who could truly bloom where she was planted, who could find purpose and joy in work that mattered. And as she took her husband's hand and they walked home together through the bustling streets of their adopted neighborhood, past the pushcart vendors calling out their wares in a dozen different languages, past the children playing games that transcended cultural boundaries, past the families working together to build better lives in a new country, Evangeline knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of her story were still being written. The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities: the conference in Washington, the potential to influence medical education nationally, the opportunity to help establish clinics in other cities. But more than any professional achievement, she treasured the knowledge that she had found her true calling, her authentic self, her place in the world where she could make a meaningful contribution. The golden cage of her Newport youth had been beautiful, but ultimately empty. The life she had built in the tenements of New York was challenging, sometimes difficult, often demanding, but it was real, and it was hers. And it was filled with the kind of purpose and satisfaction that no amount of inherited privilege could ever provide. If this story of transformation and triumph resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, resilience, and the power of choosing your own destiny. Evangeline's journey from a humiliated bride to a pioneering social reformer reminds us that sometimes our greatest defeats become the foundation for our most meaningful victories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed like complete devastation but turned out to be the liberation you didn't know you needed? What would you have done in Evangeline's position when the Duke publicly rejected her? Would you have had the courage to rebuild your life so completely, or would you have retreated into bitterness and regret? We'd love to hear your own stories of transformation. Have you ever discovered that your true calling was completely different from what others expected of you? Tell us about a time when someone else's cruelty or rejection actually opened doors you never knew existed. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of remarkable people who refuse to let others define their worth. From Gilded Age heroines to modern-day pioneers, we bring you tales of individuals who chose purpose over prestige, meaning over money, and authentic happiness over society's shallow expectations. If you enjoyed Evangeline's story, you might also love our recent video about the millionaire's daughter who chose love over fortune, or she was called worthless but became the most powerful woman in the city. Each story reminds us that our greatest strength often emerges from our deepest struggles. Until next time, remember that sometimes the biggest mistakes others make become the greatest gifts we receive. Your worth is not determined by others' opinions. Your future is not limited by others' expectations. And your happiness should never depend on others' approval. Keep blooming where you're planted, and we'll see you in the next story.